every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The English countryside, in the deepest hours before dawn, possesses a unique kind of silence. It's not an absence of sound, but a tapestry of it. The rustle of a badger in the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl, the gentle sigh of wind through ancient oaks. On August 8, 1963, this delicate symphony was pierced by something alien, something mechanical and relentlessly rhythmic, the clatter of steel wheels on steel rails. This was the sound of the Glasgow to London travelling post office, the Up Special, a workhorse of the British Royal Mail, thundering south through the sleeping heart of Buckinghamshire. Inside, it was a world unto itself. A dozen carriages filled with postal workers, men in shirt sleeves sorting a river of letters and parcels under the steady glow of fluorescent lights. But one of these carriages, the second one behind the engine, was different. It was the high-value packages coach, an anonymous green wagon that was, for all intents and purposes, a mobile bank vault. On this particular night, in the run-up to a long bank holiday weekend, it was carrying a truly extraordinary cargo. 120 mail bags, stuffed with used banknotes, unmarked and untraceable, on their way to be destroyed. The sum was an astonishing £2.6 million. The train was on time, as it almost always was. Its driver, a 57-year-old veteran named Jack Mills, knew this route like the back of his hand. He was a man of routine, of timetables and signals. So when he saw the amber signal up ahead at Sears Crossing, he eased off the power as expected. When it switched to red, he did what he had done thousands of times before. He applied the brakes. The locomotive hissed, the great iron machine groaned, and the mail train slowed to a perfect orderly stop, exactly where it was supposed to. But it wasn't supposed to. Not here, not in the middle of nowhere, with no station in sight, and no reason for a halt. A deep sense of unease settled over the driver's cab. It was in this moment of quiet confusion, in this disruption of the mundane, that one of the most audacious, romanticized, and ultimately catastrophic crimes of the 20th century began. A crime that was not merely a robbery, but a meticulously planned, military-style operation. Tonight, we dissect the anatomy of a classic heist. We will explore the clockwork planning of a gang of ambitious thieves, the low-tech ingenuity that stopped a speeding train in its tracks, and the cascading series of human errors that would unravel it all. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery, a crime whose legend would far outstrip the reality of its flawed execution. The idea, like most grand criminal ambitions, began not with a bang, but with a whisper. The criminal underworld of 1960s London was a close-knit, almost familial society. It was a world of smoky pubs, backroom deals, and unspoken codes. Within this world, there were whispers of the big one, a score so large it would set a man up for life. For years, the traveling post office train had been the subject of these whispers. It was known to carry cash, but the details were hazy, the security formidable. It was a fantasy job, the kind of thing you'd talk about over a pint but never seriously attempt. That changed when a man named Bruce Reynolds entered the picture. Reynolds was not your typical London gangster. He was dapper, charismatic, and intelligent. He styled himself as an antiques dealer, a man of taste and sophistication who just happened to be a career criminal. He had a reputation for meticulous planning and an ambition that dwarfed that of his peers. He had orchestrated a number of successful robberies, including a major payroll heist at London Airport. But he yearned for something more. He wanted a legacy. He wanted a crime that would be remembered, a perfect score that would become a benchmark for all others. The whisper about the mail train reached Reynolds, through his associate and friend, Gordon Goody. Goody, a hairdresser by trade and a thief by profession, had a source. This source, a shadowy figure who has been mythologized under the name, the Ulsterman, remains one of the great mysteries of the case. His true identity has never been definitively confirmed. What is known is that he possessed an astonishing level of inside information. He knew the train's schedule, the layout of the high-value packages coach, the routines of the staff, and, most critically, he knew when the train would be carrying its heaviest load. He told them that after the August bank holiday, the train heading south from Glasgow would be laden with cash. This was the key that unlocked the fantasy. With concrete intelligence, the heist transformed from a pipe dream into a logistical challenge. Reynolds began to assemble his team. This wasn't a job for a handful of smash-and-grab thugs. This required specialists. It demanded discipline, nerve, and a range of skills. He drew from the cream of London's criminal elite, merging two rival South London firms for the operation. First, there was Buster Edwards. A former boxer and nightclub owner, Edwards was tough, fiercely loyal, and had a reputation as a man who could handle himself. He was the quintessential London villain, straight from central casting. Then came Charlie Wilson, the gang's treasurer and enforcer. Wilson was a different breed, quiet, thoughtful, but with an undercurrent of menace that commanded respect. He was the man who would handle the money and ensure everyone stayed in line. A more peripheral, yet ultimately famous, member was Ronnie Biggs. At the time, Biggs was a small-time crook, a carpenter by trade, with a string of minor convictions. He wasn't in Reynolds's league, but he knew a retired train driver, who he claimed could be recruited for the job, a crucial skill the gang lacked. Biggs's inclusion was almost an afterthought, a matter of convenience. It was a decision that would have monumental consequences for the public perception of the crime decades later. The most critical technical specialist was Roy James, nicknamed the Weasel. James was a silversmith and a highly skilled amateur racing driver. In an era before police helicopters and advanced tracking, the getaway was everything. James's job was to get the gang and the money away from the crime scene faster than anyone could follow. He demanded a 10% cut of the proceeds just for his driving skills, a testament to his importance. In total, the core team consisted of 15 men. It was a veritable who's who of the London underworld. They met in secret, in the back rooms of pubs, and in private apartments, poring over the information from the Ulsterman. Reynolds was the chairman of the board, orchestrating the discussions, delegating tasks, and ensuring every detail was scrutinized. This was the anatomy of the plan's conception. A fusion of priceless inside intelligence with the logistical expertise of a seasoned criminal mastermind. The target location was chosen with geographic precision. They needed a remote spot, far from any town, but with easy access to a road for the getaway. It also needed to be on a stretch of track with a signal that could be easily manipulated. Their inside man, the Ulsterman, helped them pinpoint the perfect place. Sears Crossing, a lonely spot on the main line where the track ran down a slight embankment to a small country bridge, Bridego Bridge. The method for stopping the train was one of low-tech genius. They wouldn't try to block the tracks or derail the engine, actions that were unpredictable and could lead to disaster. Instead, they would manipulate the signals. The plan was to tamper with the green trackside light. They would cover it with a simple leather glove and then power the red danger light using a pair of 6-volt batteries wired together. To the approaching driver, it would look like a perfectly normal stop signal. It was simple, quiet, and required no explosives or brute force. Once the train was stopped, one team would be tasked with storming the locomotive, neutralizing the driver and his firemen, and uncoupling the engine and the first two carriages, the high-value packages coach and a buffer coach, from the rest of the train. The recruited driver would then move this shortened train a half-mile down the track to Bridego Bridge, where the second team would be waiting with the getaway vehicles. This separation was crucial. It would isolate the target carriage from the dozens of postal workers in the rest of the train, preventing them from interfering or raising the alarm too quickly. The getaway was planned like a military extraction. They acquired 2 World War I-era Land Rovers and an Austin lorry. These rugged vehicles could handle the country lanes and carry the immense weight of the cash. The route was meticulously mapped out, avoiding major roads and towns, and their destination was the most crucial element of the post-theist plan, a rented, isolated farmhouse. This was Leatherslade Farm, a rundown property nestled in the Oxfordshire countryside, about 27 miles from the crime scene. Reynolds understood that the most dangerous period for any criminal crew is the immediate aftermath of a major score. The police would be everywhere, roadblocks would be up, and the temptation for gang members to flash their cash would be irresistible. The farmhouse was to be their sanctuary. The plan was to drive there, lay low for several days, listen to the radio to gauge the police response, divide the money, and then, once the initial heat had died down, melt away individually. To complete the illusion of normalcy, they even paid a man to come and clean the farm after they left, to wipe away any trace of their presence. The plan was, in theory, perfect. It was a symphony of criminal expertise, a masterpiece of logistics. But as the gang gathered in the darkness on the night of August 7th, they were unaware that their brilliant plan contained the seeds of its own destruction. The night of the robbery was cool and still. The gang assembled near the target site, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Dressed in boiler suits and masks, they were a ghostly army moving through the darkness. They were armed, primarily with kashas and iron bars. A deliberate decision by Reynolds to avoid firearms, and the mandatory life sentences that would come with any death. Their final preparations were carried out with quiet efficiency. The lookout men took their positions. The signal tampering team went to work, climbing the post and executing their simple but brilliant hack. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Just after 3 a.m., they heard it. The distant rumble, the growing clatter of the up special on its journey south. The train came into view, its single headlamp cutting a cone of light through the blackness. It was moving at speed, around 70 miles per hour. For a heart-stopping moment, there was a fear that the driver might not see the signal, that he might thunder straight through their trap. But Jack Mills was a professional. He saw the red light, and he did his job. The train began to slow, its brakes screaming in protest, the massive momentum of the machine reluctantly bleeding away. It came to a halt precisely where the gang had intended. The silence that followed was shattered by the gang's assault. They swarmed from the embankment. One team, led by Buster Edwards, made for the engine. They clambered into the cab to find Jack Mills and his 26-year-old co-driver, David Whitby. The 2 railwaymen were utterly bewildered. Mills was on the trackside phone, trying to contact the signalman to find out why they had been stopped. He was met not with an explanation, but with a horde of masked figures. What happened next became the single most controversial and damaging aspect of the robbery. While the gang had planned to avoid lethal force, the initial moments of the raid were chaotic and violent. Jack Mills put up a brief struggle, and was struck over the head with a blunt instrument, most likely an iron bar. The blow was severe, fracturing his skull and causing serious bleeding. He was dragged, dazed and injured, from his cab. This single act of violence fundamentally changed the nature of the crime. It was no longer a clever, bloodless heist. It was now a brutal assault. With the drivers subdued, the first major problem arose. The gang's expert, the retired train driver Ronnie Biggs had recruited, was unable to operate this modern diesel-electric locomotive. He was familiar with older models, but the complex controls of the Class 40 engine were alien to him. Panic began to set in. The clock was ticking. Every minute they were delayed increased their risk of discovery. In a moment of grim irony, they were forced to rely on their victim. They hauled the injured and semi-conscious Jack Mills back into his cab and ordered him to move the train forward to the designated spot at Bridego Bridge. Bleeding from his head wound, Mills complied, driving his own train to the site of its ransacking. At the bridge, the second team was waiting. Their target was the high-value packages coach. The postal workers inside, hearing the commotion and the unscheduled stop, had locked and bolted the doors. The gang used axes and crowbars to smash their way in, terrifying the handful of staff on board, who were quickly overpowered and made to lie face down on the floor. Now came the Herculean task of moving the money. The mail bags were heavy, each one weighing a significant amount. The gang formed a human chain, a frantic conveyor belt of bodies, passing the bags from the coach, down the steep embankment, and into the waiting lorry. 120 bags in total. It was a frenzy of activity, illuminated only by the faint light of the moon and the gang's torches. In just under 30 minutes, it was over. The lorry was loaded with £2.6 million in cash. The gang piled into their Land Rovers and the truck, and with a final roar of engines, they vanished into the network of dark country lanes. They had done it. They had pulled off the crime of the century. As they sped towards the sanctuary of Leatherslade Farm, they were euphoric, believing the hardest part was over. They could not have been more wrong. The alarm was first raised by the postal workers left behind on the stranded portion of the train. Confused and shaken, they eventually made their way to the nearest signal box. The initial reports that reached the police were chaotic, but the sheer scale of the theft quickly became apparent. This was no ordinary robbery. It was an unprecedented event. Scotland Yard was immediately notified, and the case was handed to its elite crime-fighting unit, the Flying Squad. The man chosen to lead the investigation was Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper. Slipper was a legend in the yard, a tenacious old-school detective with an encyclopedic knowledge of London's criminal fraternity. He was nicknamed Slipper of the Yard, a formidable figure who relied on shoe leather, instinct, and a network of informants. He assembled a task force of his best detectives, and they immediately descended on the crime scene at Sears Crossing. The initial investigation at the tracks yielded little. The gang had been disciplined, wearing gloves and leaving behind almost no forensic evidence. The police were facing a daunting task. The robbers had a significant head start, and with £2.6 million in untraceable notes, they could disappear anywhere in the world. The press dubbed the crime the Great Train Robbery, and the story became a global sensation. The public was captivated by the audacity and scale of the heist. A massive reward was offered for information, and the pressure on Slipper and his team was immense. Meanwhile, at Leatherslade Farm, the gang was celebrating. They had arrived safely, their vehicles hidden in the barns. They broke open bottles of beer and spirits, congratulating themselves on their success. The adrenaline of the heist gave way to the dizzying reality of the loot. Bags of money were everywhere, piled up in the dilapidated farmhouse. They began the arduous task of counting and dividing it. Their plan was to stay put for at least a week, letting the initial police dragnet run its course before they dispersed. But the plan began to crumble almost immediately, a victim of human psychology. The gang did something that, in retrospect, was a catastrophic error. They listened to the news on a transistor radio. They heard the breathless reports, the sheer scale of the police response, the public outcry over the attack on Jack Mills. They learned that the Royal Mail was offering a £10,000 reward, a colossal sum at the time. The narrative they had constructed for themselves, that of clever, non-violent thieves, was being shattered. The media portrayed them as a violent, ruthless gang. Paranoia began to creep in. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a trap. They had planned for a police investigation, but not for this level of intensity. The national manhunt was far larger and more sophisticated than they had anticipated. The pressure became too much. Against Bruce Reynolds's better judgment, the collective decision was made to abandon the farm early. The new plan was to leave that Friday, just 2 days after the robbery, and take their shares with them. This panicked decision led to the second, even more critical mistake. The man they had paid to come and professionally clean the farm of all evidence was not due to arrive for several more days. With their new accelerated timetable, they had to do the job themselves. They attempted to wipe down surfaces and burn incriminating items like the mailbags and boiler suits. But their cleanup was rushed, amateurish, and woefully incomplete. They were professional criminals, not professional cleaners. In their haste and lingering euphoria, they became careless. They had spent 2 days living in the farmhouse, eating, drinking, and playing games to pass the time. And in doing so, they had left their mark. After dividing the money, the gang fled Leatherslade farm, scattering to the four winds, each man carrying a fortune. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. They had left behind the perfect crime scene for the police to find. The breakthrough for Jack Slipper's team came 5 days after the robbery. A local herdsman, who had noted the unusual activity at the supposedly vacant Leatherslade farm, contacted the local police. He had seen vehicles coming and going at odd hours, and the windows blacked out. It was the tip Slipper had been desperate for. He and his team descended on the farm, not knowing what they would find. What they found was an investigator's dream. The gang's botched cleanup had left behind a treasure trove of evidence. In the cellar, they found the partially burned mailbags. Outside, they found the Land Rovers and the lorry, hastily painted yellow in a crude attempt at disguise. But the real gold was inside the farmhouse itself. Despite the attempts to wipe it down, the place was littered with the gang's fingerprints. The robbers had been careful during the heist, wearing leather gloves. But back at the farm, feeling safe and relaxed, they had let their guard down. They had handled plates, cups, and bottles. The forensic teams from Scotland Yard moved in and began a painstaking search. They dusted every surface, every object, and the prints started to appear. One of the most iconic discoveries was a Monopoly set. The gang had used the board game to pass the time, playing with real money from the robbery. In doing so, several of them had left their fingerprints all over the board, the box, and the playing pieces. It was a detail that captured the public imagination. Hardened criminals playing a family board game with their stolen loot. They found prints on a ketchup bottle, on a beer can, and on the fixtures in the bathroom. The farm was a forensic goldmine. Each latent print was carefully lifted, photographed, and sent back to the Fingerprint Bureau at Scotland Yard. There, experts began the laborious process of comparing them against their vast collection of prints from known criminals. One by one, they began to get matches. The first positive identification came back to a man named Charles Wilson. Then another, for Gordon Goody. Then Roy James. The anonymous masked phantoms from the train were starting to get names and faces. Jack Slipper now had his targets. The investigation transformed from a search for ghosts into a targeted manhunt for a specific group of men. The police released the names of the wanted men to the press, and their faces were suddenly on the front page of every newspaper in Britain. The net began to close. The arrests came in a steady, methodical sequence. Informants, tempted by the huge reward, began to talk. The police raided homes, pubs, and known criminal haunts. Roy James, the getaway driver, was captured after a dramatic rooftop chase in London. Charlie Wilson was tracked down to a flat where he was hiding out. Buster Edwards was cornered. One by one, the core members of the gang were rounded up. Ronnie Biggs was arrested at his home. Police found his fingerprints on that ketchup bottle from the farm, and a large amount of cash hidden in his house. The mastermind, Bruce Reynolds, proved more elusive. He managed to escape the initial dragnet, using his intelligence and criminal connections to go on the run. He would remain a fugitive for 5 years, a constant source of frustration for Slipper. But the bulk of his carefully selected team was now in custody, their dream of a life of luxury replaced by the grim reality of a prison cell. The brilliant anatomy of their heist had been completely undone by the simple, sloppy anatomy of their escape. The fingerprints left behind at Leatherslade Farm were the indelible signature of their failure. The trial of the Great Train Robbers began in January 1964 in the small town of Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire, not far from where the crime had been committed. It was the trial of the century, a media circus that attracted reporters from all over the world. The courtroom was packed every day as the prosecution, led by Attorney General Sir John Hobson, laid out its case. The evidence was overwhelming. The centerpiece of the prosecution's argument was the forensic link to Leatherslade Farm. The fingerprints found on the Monopoly board, the ketchup bottle, and other items directly placed many of the defendants at the hideout where the stolen mailbags were found. This physical evidence, combined with testimony from witnesses, and the discovery of large sums of cash linked to the robbery, created a seemingly unbreakable case against most of the accused. The defense lawyers did their best to pick holes in the prosecution's narrative. They argued that the presence of a fingerprint at the farm did not prove participation in the robbery itself. They tried to discredit informants and challenge the chain of custody for the evidence. But they were fighting an uphill battle against a mountain of incriminating facts. The public was captivated by the proceedings. Following the testimony of the railwaymen, the police officers, and the forensic experts. After a trial that lasted over 50 days, the jury delivered its verdict. Most of the key players, including Charlie Wilson, Buster Edwards, Roy James, and Gordon Goody, were found guilty of conspiracy to rob. The judge, Mr. Justice Edmund Davies, then delivered his sentences, and they were stunning in their severity. He was determined to make an example of the gang. In his sentencing remarks, he condemned their crime as a sordid crime of violence and greed, and drew a parallel to an act of war against the community. He sentenced 7 of the main conspirators, including Wilson, Edwards, and James, to 30 years in prison. Others received sentences ranging from 20 to 25 years. These were sentences far harsher than anyone had expected, more akin to those given for murder or treason than for robbery, even one on this scale. The severity of the sentences sparked a public debate, while many felt the punishment fit the crime, especially given the brutal attack on Jack Mills. Others saw it as excessively punitive. This sense of injustice, however misplaced, contributed to the first stirrings of the robbers' transformation from villains into anti-establishment folk heroes. But the story was far from over. The lengthy prison sentences were meant to be the final chapter, but for some of the robbers, they were merely an obstacle to be overcome. In August 1964, just a few months after his sentencing, Charlie Wilson, the gang's formidable treasurer, staged a daring escape from Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. A three-man team broke into the prison, overpowered the guards, and sprung Wilson from his cell. He was spirited away and vanished, becoming the first of the train robbers to go on the run. His escape was a major embarrassment for the authorities and a huge boost to the gang's growing legend. An even more spectacular escape followed a year later. In July 1965, Ronnie Biggs, who had played a relatively minor role in the robbery itself, cemented his place in criminal folklore. From inside London's Wandsworth prison, he and a small group of other inmates used a rope ladder, smuggled in by accomplices, to scale the 30-foot prison wall during exercise hour. They dropped into a waiting furniture van and disappeared. Biggs's life on the run would become the stuff of legend. He underwent plastic surgery in Paris, then fled to Australia with his family. When Scotland Yard, led by the relentless Jack Slipper, closed in on him there, he escaped again, this time to Brazil. Brazil, at the time, had no extradition treaty with the United Kingdom, and Biggs discovered a legal loophole. He was immune from extradition because his Brazilian girlfriend was pregnant with his child. He lived openly in Rio de Janeiro for decades, taunting the British authorities, selling his story to tabloid newspapers, and cultivating an image as a lovable rogue. He became, for better or worse, the public face of the Great Train Robbery. While Biggs was living a life of sun-soaked infamy, the other gang members had different fates. Charlie Wilson was eventually recaptured in Canada in 1968 after 4 years of freedom and was returned to prison. Buster Edwards, after a period on the run in Mexico, found he couldn't bear being separated from his family. He negotiated his surrender and returned to the UK to serve his sentence. The last of the key players to be brought to justice was the architect himself, Bruce Reynolds. He had successfully evaded capture for 5 years, living in Mexico and Canada before secretly returning to England when his money ran out. He was living a quiet, unassuming life in the seaside town of Torquay when Jack Slipper's team finally tracked him down in 1968. The great manhunt was finally over. The mastermind of the crime of the century was arrested without a struggle. His dream of a legacy had been realized, just not in the way he had envisioned. The final accounting of the Great Train Robbery is a study in contrasts. The gang stole £2.6 million, an astronomical sum, yet the vast majority of it, over £2.3 million, was never recovered. It was either spent by the fugitives, laundered through businesses, or remains hidden to this day. The human cost was also steep. The train driver, Jack Mills, never fully recovered from the head injury he sustained. He was plagued by trauma and persistent headaches, and was unable to return to the job he loved. He died of leukemia in 1970. His family has always maintained that his early death was a direct result of the attack. His co-driver, David Whitby, also suffered from severe post-traumatic stress and died of a heart attack at the age of 34. The gang members themselves paid a heavy price. They served exceptionally long prison sentences. Upon release, few found the life of luxury they had dreamed of. Buster Edwards famously ended up running a flower stall outside Waterloo Station. Bruce Reynolds, the sophisticated mastermind, struggled to find work and lived a quiet life before his death in 2013. Only Ronnie Biggs, through his notoriety, managed to profit from the crime long-term, though it came at the cost of permanent exile until he voluntarily returned to the UK in poor health in 2001 to finally face prison. So what then is the ultimate anatomy of this classic heist? It is a story of profound duality. The plan itself was a marvel of criminal engineering. It was audacious, meticulously researched, and brilliantly conceived with a focus on non-lethal, low-tech solutions. The coordination of a 15-man team, the sourcing of inside intelligence, the pinpointing of the location, and the manipulation of the signals, all represent a masterclass in criminal logistics. Yet this brilliance was anchored to a fatal flaw: the utter collapse of discipline in the aftermath. The gang's undoing was not a clever piece of detective work or a lucky break for the police. It was their own arrogance, their own panic, their own human error. Leatherslade Farm, which should have been their greatest asset, became their tombstone. The fingerprints left on a Monopoly board and a ketchup bottle are a stark reminder that even the most elaborate plans can be undone by the simplest of mistakes. The anatomy of the robbery is a perfect blueprint for a heist. The anatomy of the getaway is a perfect lesson in how not to execute one. The crime also carved a strange and enduring place in cultural history. The robbers became icons of a sort, anti-establishment figures who took on the system, and, for a brief moment, won. Their story has been romanticized in films and books, often glossing over the brutal violence inflicted on Jack Mills. They became legends, but their legend was built on a foundation of greed and a callous disregard for the ordinary working men who stood in their way. The true legacy of the Great Train Robbery lies in this very conflict: the tension between the clockwork precision of the crime and the messy, all-too-human nature of the criminals. It was a heist planned with the cold logic of a military operation, but executed and unraveled by men susceptible to panic, arrogance, and carelessness. Its anatomy is not just one of signals and getaway cars, but of the volatile chemistry of ambition and human fallibility. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.